Hello, this is Claudia, and for the next hour I'll be reading from the August 12th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Trump said to have secretly used military jet to leave Turkey amid threats. President Trump hid in an airport catering container and was taken to a military jet for a secret flight out of the country after the NATO summit last month. Top administration officials engaged in an elaborate deception to spirit President Trump out of Turkey during the NATO summit there last month, transporting him in a catering container to a military jet because of a threat against him in Air Force One from Iran, two senior U.S. officials said on Monday. Mr. Trump and other officials had said publicly that he would be leaving Turkey on July 8th aboard one of the older versions of Air Force One rather than a luxury 747-8 donated by Qatar that he had flown in on. Mr. Trump told reporters at the time that he was making the switch for old time's sake. Mr. Trump boarded the older plane from the left side door in view of cameras, and news organizations, including the New York Times, reported that he had traveled on it to Britain, where he switched back to the newer plane. The Times reported at the time that the decision was driven in part by concern about the security of the new plane, donated by Qatar, which had not been equipped with all of the defensive capabilities of older versions. But instead of flying out aboard the older powder blue modified 747, Mr. Trump was whisked off that plane via a catering container that had been lifted to the opposite side of the plane from where the journalist traveling with him boarded, one of the U.S. officials said. The president was then taken to a third plane which he flew in secret to Britain, the official with knowledge of the matter said. Reporters on the older plane were not told that Mr. Trump had not flown with them from Turkey to an airbase in Britain, making them unwitting participants in the ruse and leaving them along with some White House staff members to serve as unknowing decoys. After Mr. Trump arrived in Britain, he was secretly moved back to the older version of Air Force One. He then disembarked in view of reporters and walked across the tarmac to the plane donated by Qatar, which he flew to Washington. The elaborate plan appears to have been developed in a matter of hours after officials determined that a threat against Mr. Trump from Iran was credible. It came after years of threats against Mr. Trump from Iran and amid the war he launched against that country. And it was an unusual instance of the public being deceived about a president's whereabouts. Officials have not previously acknowledged that Mr. Trump was not where they claimed he was. The furtive operation was reported earlier by the Washington Post, which identified the plane that carried the president to Britain from Turkey as a C-32A, a military variant of a Boeing 757. It is rare for presidents to travel without the reporters who comprise the press pool designated to be with them or in their vicinity without some general awareness of the commander-in-chief's whereabouts. President George W. Bush kept a slimmed-down press pool with him as he flew first to a military base and then back to Washington in the chaotic hours after the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, and presidents, including Mr. Trump, have traveled to war zones with reporters alongside them. Donald Mahalik, a former Secret Service agent who worked in the protective details for Mr. Bush and President Barack Obama, said, "The Secret Service has used decoy motorcades and flights in the past to move presidents secretly. Anytime the president is in a theater where there's potential combat danger, the Secret Service has employed protective countermeasures, including the use of a decoy," Mr. Mahalik said. He added that the agency has long prioritized the security of the president over transparency with the public. "The agency is not the agency of public affairs," he said. "The agency is the agency of the Secret Service. Their number one job is to keep the president safe." In this case, the threat led the White House to purposely mislead reporters assigned to cover Mr. Trump, leaving journalists to report that he was traveling on board a plane that was being used as a decoy. After the Times reported last month on the security shortcomings of the Qatari-donated jet amid the concerns about the threat from Iran, Stephen Chung, the White House communications director, seemed to hint that subterfuge might have been involved in Mr. Trump's departure from Turkey. As the president has said recently, there are many enemies of America who have had their sights on him, and we use every tool at our disposal, including distraction and misdirection, to address those threats, he said at the time. The threat from Iran was not specific to the Qatari-donated jet. People familiar with the sequence of events said instead Mr. Trump was being targeted on whatever plane he was traveling on, as the Times had previously reported. Mr. Trump was briefed on the threat while in Turkey, and a plan was soon put in place with a small group of top government officials involved, including General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, the official with knowledge of the deception plan, said. The Defense Department and a spokesman for General Kane referred all questions to the White House on Monday. The White House reissued Mr. Chong's statement from the week of NATO summit, only without the clause mentioning distraction and misdirection. The U.S. officials with the knowledge of the deception plan spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive security measures. When Mr. Trump arrived at the airport to leave Turkey, a camera that had been positioned beforehand captured him getting on the old Air Force One, and journalists traveling with him rushing to board the plane through lower steps in the back had only a glimpse of him. A pool report noted as the plane took off, "We have been advised to keep our window shades in the press cabin closed." The older Air Force One landed at 10:16 p.m. at the Mildenhall military base in England, a pool report said, with Mr. Trump stepping off at 40 minutes later. Before that, unbeknown to reporters, Mr. Trump was brought by vehicle from the third plane that he had arrived on in the older Air Force One, boarded it through a different entrance, and strode down the step from the upper left side, as he would typically do, according to the U.S. official. He walked down there to the Qatari jet as a small group of reporters who had traveled aboard the older jet watched. The president and the press pool then boarded the new plane to fly back to Washington. When asked by reporters during the flight back to the United States about why they had flown on the old Air Force One to England, Mr. Trump claimed he had wanted the troops stationed at the UK base to see the new plane. When pressed on why the window blinds had been directed to be shut on the flight from Turkey, Mr. Trump said that he knew of no specific threat, but described himself as under constant siege from Iran. "I'm number one on their list before you," he told the reporters, "but if I go, you go, right?" Mr. Trump and a number of his advisors have faced threats from Iran for years, especially after Mr. Trump, during his first term, ordered the killing of a powerful Iranian commander, Major General Qasem Soleimani. Mr. Trump's advisors during the 2024 campaign privately told allies that they were given intelligence that Iran still hoped to harm Mr. Trump. That led to the occasional use of decoy planes during the campaign. His staff at times put the candidate aboard a secret jet without alerting the media while his staff flew his private plane. The Biden administration increased security for Mr. Trump that summer. After new intelligence about plots to kill Mr. Trump a short time later, he faced an unrelated assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania, at an outdoor rally. There was a second unrelated attempt in September 2024. The collective threats, which ranged from a prosecuted murder-for-hire plot by an Iranian proxy to the hacking of Trump campaign officials' email and social media accounts, created a siege climate for the candidate and his aides. It led to fear, insularity, and times paranoia that shaped how officials interacted with the Biden administration, which was responsible for allocating Secret Service resources, as well as with the media and with other government officials. After the Times reported about the security concerns in Turkey and the fact that the Qatari jet lacked the same defensive capabilities as the older presidential aircraft, Mr. Trump was enraged by the leaks. The Justice Department issued subpoenas for grand jury testimony to the reporters who had been on the bylines of the stories, as well as some of their family members. Those subpoenas were withdrawn after a federal judge admonished federal prosecutors for the process involved. Mr. Trump has continued to rage about information coming from his government that contradicts what he is telling the public, particularly about the war in Iran that he began on February 28th, according to multiple officials. Trump's tariffs forced some Canadian companies to consider moving south. If President Trump moves ahead with 50% tariffs on a wide range of Canadian products later this month, some companies may only survive by relocating to the United States. At Northern Cables, the machinery that churns out steel-clad cable runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The push isn't driven by a flood of new orders, it's driven by fear. The Canadian company is rushing to fill warehouses across the United States. It is one of many businesses making goods in Canada for U.S. customers that now face pressure to move their factories south of the border to avoid President Trump's 50% tariffs, which are scheduled to start next week on their products. Mr. Trump's latest tariff salvo hits particularly close to home. for Northern Cables. Its factory, partly housed in a former Coca-Cola bottling plant, sits about 2.5 miles north of the invisible line dividing Ontario and the New York State along the St. Lawrence River. With half of its business coming from the United States, the company is now considering a move south. It would be a striking reversal for Northern Cables, which was founded in 1996 to keep cable making in Brockville, Ontario, after a U.S.-based company closed its plant there and shifted production out of Canada. But if Mr. Trump's tariffs on a wide range of goods, including electric cable, take effect as planned on August 19th, Shelley Bacon, the company's chief executive, said that he and Todd Stafford, its president, will have to start looking for an American factory. Todd and I are going to have to go down and go shopping, Mr. Bacon said, seated at a boardroom table where short lengths of cable made at the factory were displayed under glass. We have too many jobs at stake here to just do nothing. Northern Cables normally divides production of its armored electrical cables, which power everything from office towers to underground mines, evenly between Canadian and American customers, but to stock its U.S. warehouses, about 80% of the cable now being wound onto spools that weigh up to 12,000 pounds is being made to American electrical standards. Mr. Stafford estimates that the U.S. warehouses will be emptied within 2 to 3 weeks. Northern Cables, which has 320 employees, is not alone. A survey of 275 manufacturers conducted by the polling firm Angus Reid for KPMG found that 29% had moved some or all of their production to the United States since Mr. Trump started his trade war with Canada. Another 13% more were considering it. The survey was conducted in May before Mr. Trump announced his latest 50% tariffs. If the trade and tariff uncertainty continues, and if there is not a focus from the government on some of the systemic issues that impact manufacturing in Canada, these manufacturers may not have a choice but to start moving to the U.S., said Anamika Gadia, KPMG's national leader for industrial markets in Canada. It's not necessarily their desire, but they may be left with little choice. In Ottawa, Ambico makes highly specialized doors, bullet-resistant, blast-resistant, soundproof, fireproof, and eavesdropping-proof, found in buildings including the Pentagon and the Eisenhower Executive Office Building at the White House complex. Jack Schninder, the company's chief executive, once had no idea where the steel arriving at his factory was made. It simply came flattened and roughly cut from a processor in Montreal. But after the United States imposed a 25% tariff on products made largely from steel or aluminum, Mr. Schninder made sure that the suppliers sent only U.S.-made steel, cutting the effective tariff rate on the company's doors, which cost roughly $5,000 to $20,000 each, to about 10%. So I'm not going to be susceptible for the moment, Mr. Schninder said. The problem is what happens when the administration changes its mind tomorrow afternoon, or next month, or in 3 months. Nobody knows. Ambico, started by Mr. Schninder's father and uncle in 1955, initially only sold metal doors and frames around Ottawa before expanding into Montreal and Toronto. After Mr. Schninder returned in 1980 from university and theological studies in the U.S., he pushed to expand into upstate New York. It was an unconventional idea at the time for a small Canadian manufacturer outside the auto industry, years before Canada and the United States signed their first free trade agreement in 1989. I had this comfort with doing business in America just 45 minutes from here, Mr. Schninder said. Then we realized that there was a lot more business in the upper tier states than there was in Ontario and Quebec, and there wasn't the competition. About 2/3 of Ambico's business now comes from the United States. Still, Mr. Schninder said he will not move the company south. The 120 people that I employ here know that I am not, he said. But how am I going to sustain my business is really the question. A few years ago, Ambico explored opening a second plant in upstate New York, but abandoned the idea after concluding it could not find enough workers. Instead, Mr. Schninder plans to license some of the company's technology to American door makers and expand into Europe, where Ambico is now certifying its doors for European standards. He expects that market to replace only about 15% of the company's business. He said that he expects the company may lose money for 1 or 2 years because of the tariffs. I think we can weather the storms, he said. I do. Maybe I'm being naive. Northern Cables is also eyeing Europe, though the path is harder. European electrical standards do not currently allow armored electrical cable to be used as industrial wiring, so cables must be threaded through steel pipes instead. Mr. Stafford said the company is seeking approval to change that, but expects the process could take 15 years. Mr. Trump is not Northern Cable's only trade headache. Mr. Bacon said that after the United States imposed steep tariffs on electrical cables from China, those products began flowing into Canada. China exported about 538 million Canadian dollars worth of wire and cables to Canada in 2024, up from $327 million in 2015. In 2024, Canada imported $872 million in cables from the United States and shipped cables worth $704 million to American customers. We're getting hammered at in Canada by Chinese imports, Mr. Bacon said, adding that he's frustrated by what he views as a lack of interest in the Canadian government about the situation, although Canada recently imposed tariffs on some smaller cables from China, a minor product in Northern Cable's portfolio. Like Mr. Schinder, Mr. Stafford said he was worried about finding enough workers for an American plant that would not entirely escape tariffs. Canadian companies would still need to import large amounts of aluminum because the United States has limited capacity to produce the metal. Right now, the aluminum faces a 50% tariff. But if new Trump tariffs take effect on August 19th, Mr. Stafford said, the company will move quickly. We're going to have to go into overdrive to figure out where can we get some space, where can we put some machines, how can we start this process. He said, we've started now, but just quietly, right now. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Heat kills hundreds of workers each year. A postal carrier was one. About half a dozen states explicitly protect workers from excessive heat, and some others, like Texas, prevent local governments from passing their own laws. The afternoon temperature soared to 98 degrees as Danny Rodriguez slammed the door of his Postal Service van 3 years ago on this same route through a leafy Dallas neighborhood. Another mail carrier died from hypothermia. Mr. Rodriguez thinks about the man often, especially during summer shifts. The job can drain you, said Mr. Rodriguez, who has been a mail carrier for 13 years and wears a wide brim hat to block the sun. As scorching temperatures and high humidity blanket much of the country this summer, with cities notching record highs, outdoor workers face increasingly perilous conditions with limited rules to protect them. Texas has even barred its cities and counties from passing local heat protections, arguing that mandates aren't necessary. There are no specific mandatory federal rules to protect workers from extreme heat, and the Trump administration is working to cut back proposed Biden-era heat rules that would have mandated breaks in access to water. Republicans in Congress have gone further, proposing legislation that would prohibit the Department of Labor from adopting the Biden-era proposals. But the risks of on-the-job heat exposure will only worsen with climate change, according to safety experts and labor groups. More than 550 workers die annually from heat exposure nationwide, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration has estimated. Over the years, deaths have included a 23-year-old construction worker who became unresponsive on a job site in Arizona, a 35-year-old farm worker in Florida who became disoriented while harvesting strawberries, and 66-year-old Eugene Gates, Jr., the letter carrier who collapsed on a front lawn along the route that Mr. Rodriguez now walks. A study by researchers at George Washington University and Harvard calculated that there are 28,000 heat-related work injuries every year. Society and employers tend to dismiss the risk factors, said Barak Al-Ahmad, director of Harvard's Occupational Health and Climate Change Program and an author of the report. Heat exposure can worsen existing health issues like diabetes and asthma, and can cause fading and seizures, as well as conditions that break down muscle tissue and prompt a dangerous dip in sodium levels in the blood. Heat-related injuries can come in different forms, Dr. Al-Ahmad said. It's not just a person passing out. Around half a dozen states have adopted rules requiring employers to provide workers with resources that can help mitigate the heat. In California, employers with outdoor workers must provide shade and encourage employees to take breaks when temperatures hit 80 degrees. Failure to offer those sorts of interventions to prevent heat illness is the second most frequently cited violation by Cal OSHA, the state's workplace regulator. In 2024, the agency fined a Southern California landscaping company around $270,000 for flouting heat regulations, including denying access to shade and forcing employees to buy their own drinking water. Maryland is the only state on the East Coast with heat protections for workers. Two of the hottest states, however, have no laws for heat standards, and lawmakers there have even prevented local governments from instituting their own. In Florida, Miami-Dade County has taken steps to require shade, water, and breaks for outdoor workers, but in 2024, the state legislature passed a law barring cities and counties from adopting their own standards. A similar dynamic played out in Texas after cities like Austin and Dallas had taken measures to mandate 10-minute breaks for construction workers every 4 hours. Governor Greg Abbott signed a bill in 2023 that eliminated local rules requiring water breaks for workers. The measure was backed by business groups, including the National Federation of Independent Business, a powerful lobbying group which argued that heat regulations would be burdensome for small businesses. Associated Builders and Contractors, a trade group representing the construction industry, supported the Texas law. Jeffrey Tahuahua, the group's president in Texas, said the state law ensures that business operating across Texas are not beholden to a patchwork of conflicting local regulations. Agriculture and construction are among the most hazardous jobs for heat-related injuries, according to Dr. Alamed's research. Letter carriers who have to work outdoors all year have tallied more than 1,330 heat-related incidents during a 2-year stretch, according to a 2024 report from the Postal Service's Inspector General. On June 20, 2023, 6 days after Mr. Abbott signed the Texas legislation into law, Mr. Gates, a Dallas mail carrier, died on his route northeast of downtown. The heat index that day reached 113 degrees. Before he started what would become his last shift, Mr. Gates texted his wife Carla, who worked from home and took daily walks through their neighborhood. "If you go out, be careful," he warned her, referring to the heat. Mr. Gates, who delivered mail to 400 addresses a day, received 2 10-minute paid breaks and a 30-minute unpaid lunch break. He often checked the weather and packed extra water bottles and a cooler filled with ice. Mr. Gates took pride in interacting with people along his route, his wife said, and he made an effort to remember their faces and birthdays. But after more than 30 years as a postal carrier, he was beginning to think about retirement. Around 3:45 p.m. that day, a phone number from the post office called her cell phone. Mr. Gates had fallen in front of a house where he was delivering mail. He was rushed to a hospital. Her husband died of heart disease and hypothermia. His body temperature was 104 degrees. "He needed more support, but these workers are on their own," Miss Gates said. "The blame is on them if the mail does not get delivered. He was just doing his job," she added. OSHA fined the Postal Services $15,625 for his death, citing the agency for failing to recognize the hazard of high outdoor heat, including high temperature, high humidity, and direct sun exposure. The service declined a request for comment. Cometra Lewis, the president of the Lone Star Branch 132, a local of the National Association of Letter Carriers, said the sum was insulting. "The Postal Service, the state, all failed him," Ms. Lewis said. In an open letter from June, as temperatures began to rise, the Texas AFL-CIO, which works alongside the local letter carriers union, wrote that unions have the power to take care of workers now by sharing heat safety tips. "Acclimatization, hydration, rest breaks, and proper planning save lives," they wrote, calling for workers to organize, but we shouldn't be in this position. Last month, another Dallas area postal carrier collapsed and died during a period of extreme heat. A cause of death is pending. On a recent afternoon, Ms. Gates, age 59, took me to the neighborhood where her husband collapsed. She visits his grave regularly, but had never returned to the neighborhood where he made his final deliveries. It had been too painful. As we walked the route, we ran into Mr. Rodriguez, who was finishing up his shift. His phone calculates his steps, and most days he logs well over 10 miles. The two had never met. For a few minutes under the shade of a gnarled live oak, Miss Gates peppered Ms. Rodriguez, age 38, with questions as if she were his mother. "How are you staying hydrated?" she asked. "Plenty of water," he said, using his shirt collar to wipe sweat from his brow. "At least 2 gallons a day." "Do you take breaks, even unscheduled?" "Sometimes," he told her, "when absolutely needed." He told Miss Gates that he had known her husband, saying Mr. Gates had struck him as a quiet, thorough worker. The two said goodbye, and Mr. Rodriguez finished delivering mail to the houses on the street before hurrying back to his van parked in a shaded area. He blasted the air conditioning and drove to the next block. They spoke English, wore U.S. flags, and attacked fishermen. Who were they? Ecuadorian crews plying the waters of the Pacific have been targeted by a mysterious outfit equipped with drones. Some sailors appear to have lost their lives. Far out in the Pacific Ocean, Ecuadorian fishermen have been attacked by unidentified gringos using drones, survivors say, spurring a mystery over whether the American military, the armed forces of another country, or private military contractors were behind the strikes. One fishing boat has been lost at sea since January, the UN says, with 8 people still missing and presumed dead. The survivors of 2 other vessels said they came under attack in March by English-speaking assailants wearing matching uniforms with American flag patches but without any clear insignia to link them to an official government force. Some of the surviving fishermen said they had been hauled out of the water, questioned, and then handed over to El Salvador's Navy before being released. The Pentagon has denied involvement, as has the U.S. Coast Guard. Survivors have also said that a plane followed and seemingly surveilled them before the strikes. The New York Times analyzed flight data and found that a maritime patrol plane based out of a military base in El Salvador flew in the direction of all 3 boats in the days before they were attacked. The pilots on board spoke English with American accents, according to air traffic control communication recordings. And as the boats moved through the ocean, the plane's course also shifted to remain pointed at each of them over several days. The Times analysis found flight tracking data shows that the plane flew toward the boat that went missing in January, the Fiorella, on 4 different days, including on the day it disappeared. But the plane does not appear on the Pentagon's list of active aircraft. Instead, it was registered last October to a company that lists its address as a private mailbox in a UPS store in Richmond, Virginia, according to Federal Aviation Administration records. Since the Pentagon started blowing up boats in the Caribbean Sea and Pacific Ocean last September, accusing them of being used for drug trafficking, dozens of vessels have been attacked, killing at least 221 people. Washington has not been shy about claiming the strikes, often publishing footage on social media of tiny fishing boats cutting through the water before being obliterated by American munitions. These attacks, however, have gone unclaimed. It is certainly possible that the U.S. or some other military has conducted clandestine attacks on boats in the regions, but the many lingering questions surrounding the fishing boat attacks have led some experts to wonder whether a private military contractor has been hired by the U.S. government or one of its Latin American allies, possibly El Salvador, where the plane has operated. It would be one thing if the U.S. didn't have an overt maritime strike campaign, but they do, and they're posting snuff films of boats going up in flames regularly, and that's what makes this even more squirrely, said Brian Finucane, a former State Department lawyer who specializes in the laws of war. He worked in the Obama and Biden administrations as well as the first Trump one. Who are these people that are operating and under what authority? Mr. Finucane asked. And they are using a UPS store as their company address? Come on. Ecuadorian and Salvadorian officials did not respond to requests for comment. In November, the plane that tracked the courses of the fishing boats were flown from Tennessee to El Salvador and stationed on the military side of an airport there. Flight data show during that time the Pentagon began increasing its air assets at another nearby airport in El Salvador to support its counter-narcotics campaign in Latin America. Air traffic controllers took the patrol plane to park at the military apron. A satellite image from January shows the plane parked near military aircraft, hundreds of yards away from the closest civilian craft, and images taken from the ground show that the plane's tail is adorned with the flag of El Salvador. Still, it is unclear what role, if any, the plane played in the attacks on the fishing boats. The Trump administration has made Latin America one of its top foreign policy priorities to try to stem the flow of migrants and the region's drug cartels. Some private military contractors have shifted in kind. Earlier this year, the Trump administration discussed issuing letters of marque, which were issued by the U.S. government during the 18th century before the nation had built up its navy. The letters would allow the U.S. government to contract private security forces with maritime capabilities to protect Washington's interests at sea and to detain vessel crews. The letters, according to three people with knowledge of the discussions, were circulated among various agencies for their input in May and were supposed to complement the Pentagon's boat strike campaign in the Pacific Ocean and Caribbean Sea. Discussions around letters of marque seem to stall around June, and the Pentagon would not say whether any have been issued. When asked about the attacks on the fishing boats, it said, "We have no knowledge of, nor were U.S. Southern Command forces involved in the incidents described." Private military contractors have been active in the hemisphere. Eric Prince, whose firm Blackwater was a notorious private military contractor hired by the U.S. government in Iraq, began touring Latin America in the lead up to the 2024 election. Mr. Prince has met with the leaders of El Salvador and Ecuador to discuss regional security, although details of those conversations are unknown. One of Mr. Prince's security firms was contracted by the Haitian government last year to fight the gangs, a deal the State Department authorized. As part of that contract, Mr. Prince's company offered maritime services to patrol Haiti's coast, according to an official in Haiti familiar with the contract. A spokesperson for Mr. Prince said that neither Eric Prince nor any entities affiliated with him have any relation to these events involving Ecuadorian fishing boats. While the Pentagon strikes use sophisticated equipment, including attack planes and MQ-9 Reaper drones, the attacks on the Ecuadorian fishing vessels have been carried out by rudimentary drones fitted with explosives and deployed from a vessel manned by gringos with American flag patches who never identified themselves, a lawyer representing some of the fishermen said. Ever since the Pentagon began striking boats last year, Ecuadorian fishermen say that they have been scared to go out into the water. But the crew members of the Negra Francisca Duarte II had bills to pay and mouths to feed, they said, so they set out to sea in early March. Satisfied with their catch, they said, they headed back to the mainland, entering Ecuador's territorial waters in mid-March. That morning they were stopped by the nation's Coast Guard, inspected, and then cleared for passage, according to interviews with 5 of the crew. That afternoon, they said they noticed they were being followed by a blue boat on the horizon. About an hour later, drones flew toward them and then dropped explosive devices onto their ship, injuring several crewmen and engulfing their vessel in flames. The boys were there, hurt and scared. Some got a fire extinguisher to try to put out the fire, but there were too many flames, the captain of the Negra Francisca, Hernan Flores, told the Times. As the fire grew, some of the crew members dived into the ocean while others jumped into smaller boats attached to the Negra Francisca. They headed toward the blue ship that had been following them, hoping to be saved. "We were really scared," Mr. Flores said. As they approached the blue vessel, the crew members on board ordered the fishermen to raise their hands, communicating through a translator, the fishermen said. They said they were then bound, hooded, and held on deck overnight, receiving no medical attention, even though some were badly injured with open bleeding wounds. The men who were armed questioned the fishermen, asking whether they were carrying anything illegal. When an injured fisherman replied that they had been inspected by the Ecuadorian Coast Guard shortly before the attack, the men began arguing among each other, seemingly worried, the fishermen said. The next morning, the fishermen said they were transferred to the Salvadorian Coast Guard and taken to a naval base in La Union in El Salvador, where they were treated well. The Salvadorian authorities told them that when they received the Ecuadorian crew, the armed men described their captives only as shipwrecked fishermen. They were then released to the capital, San Salvador, with no charges, the crew member said. What struck Mr. Flores was his inability to identify the group of men on the blue boat, he said. For decades, he said, he had interacted with the navies and coast guards of Ecuador, the United States, and other nations that patrol the waters around Ecuador, one of the world's biggest routes for the illicit cocaine trade. They often sailed boats that clearly identified what branch of government they belonged to, like the Navy or the Coast Guard, and wore uniforms with insignia to match, the fishermen said. But these men wore just the American flag patches, and their vessel did not fly a flag or have other markings on it, the fishermen's lawyer said. A U.S. Coast Guard spokesman said in a statement that the Coast Guard cutter Bertolf participated in the search of the Negra Francisca. It was only about 70 miles from the fishermen. It said it had found debris from the boat, but no survivors, and suspended the search. After 12 hours, the Coast Guard and the Pentagon denied any knowledge or involvement in the attack. While it remains unclear who carried out the strikes, they came as the Pentagon stepped up its cooperation with allies across Latin America to combat the drug trade. In May, the Pentagon applied pressure on Guatemala to agree to joint U.S. airstrikes and other military action inside its borders to target suspected drug groups. Ecuador agreed to a similar deal earlier this year. Last week, U.S. Southern Command announced Joint Task Force Western Hemisphere, setting up the infrastructure for the more ambitious Latin American-wide expansion of its war against drugs in cooperation with regional allies. The attacks on the Ecuadorian fishermen should be a wake-up call for Latin American governments, argued Juanita Goberters, who leads the Americas Division at Human Rights Watch, which published its own report on the strikes. The U.S. government is prioritizing operations based on weak intelligence and with illegal use of force, she said. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. As credit card debt mounts, home becomes a piggy bank. A rise in home equity to record levels has led many Americans to refinance their mortgages to pay their bills. When Linda Borowski bought her 3-story Queen Anne home with a wraparound veranda in Bellevue, Ohio in 2021, she made sure it fit her budget. My mom taught me we like to cross our T's, dot our I's, and we pay our bills on time, said Borowski, a 63-year-old retired school teacher. So she was concerned when she ran up $26,000 in credit card bills to pay for travel for medical treatment. It meant putting off renovations for her drafty house and visiting her family less. I was so strapped each month, she said. When Miss Borowski got an offer from Rocket, a mortgage lender, for a home equity loan, she took out $45,000, paid off her bills, and bought new windows, and she still has a little left over for a trip to see her granddaughter. Americans continue to spend freely, keeping the economy humming, even as they amass more credit card debt. But like Miss Borowski, many homeowners have built up a nest egg to help pay for their lifestyles. $35 trillion in home equity, a record high. People are sitting on all this money, said Daryl Fairweather, the chief economist at Redfin, a real estate brokerage firm, so they pull some of that equity out of their home to pay off their credit card debt. Household debt dipped 0.1% in the second quarter of 2026 to $18.8 trillion from a year earlier, according to a report on Tuesday by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York using data not adjusted for inflation. But credit card balances climbed to $1.26 trillion from the year before. In the first 3 months of this year, homeowners withdrew an estimated $47 billion in equity, up 2% from a year earlier, according to a report from the Intercontinental Exchange, a financial services company. Second mortgages amounted to $25 billion, a 1% increase from a year earlier, but refinancing existing mortgages to take cash out jumped 18% year over year to $22 billion. The accumulation of housing wealth is partly a result of a moribund property market. Soaring home prices and elevated mortgage rates have made buying a home less attainable, prompting buyers to pause. Sales of existing homes fell 1.7% in July from the month before, the National Association of Realtors reported on Tuesday. Homeowners who secured mortgage rates as low as 3% just a few years ago are reluctant to sell their homes. They have built up an average of $310,500 in home equity, according to a recent report by Cotality, a housing market data provider. That equity provides an important financial cushion as everyday costs continue to rise. Selma Hepp, Cotality's chief economist, wrote in the report. That enormous wealth comes with a caveat. Because it is tied up in their homes, owners have to refinance their mortgage to take advantage of it. Still, a home loan at 6.69%, the average rate for a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, according to the mortgage finance giant Freddie Mac, is a better option than credit card debt with an interest rate in the double digits, financial experts say. Nobody really talks about their credit card rates being 23%, said Alex Elijah, the chief strategy officer at United Wholesale Mortgage, a mortgage lender that works exclusively with independent brokers. They are paying minimum payments and they kick the can down the road. But as revolving debt mounts, he is seeing more homeowners looking to refinance their mortgage. To be sure, sometimes the money goes to renovating the home or paying for a vacation, but more often he said it is used for credit card or student loan payments. Most people are looking at it as a way to bring down their overall household interest rate, he said. Financial brokers are seeing more refinancing activity across the country as more people seek to pull themselves out from under a pile of bills. The average debt per cardholder grew 22.7% from 2018 through last year to $7,161, according to a report from the Century Foundation, an independent think tank. For comparison, cumulative inflation in the same period rose 28.2%. But Stacy Melton, a broker in Gilbert, Arizona, said the people who come to her for help carry an average of $20,000 to $50,000 in credit card debt and sometimes as high as $90,000. Hoping to avoid refinancing their mortgage in order to hang on to their low rate, many request a new line of credit using their home equity as collateral, but the math never works out because the rates on most home equity lines are too high. You are basically trading apples for apples at that point, said Miss Melton, who recommends refinancing even if the homeowner snagged an ultra-low rate when buying the home. But as more Americans use their homes as emergency slush funds, Ms. Fairweather worried that the activity could put them at risk if the economy starts to tumble. They might be in a situation where they have to sell their home because they can't pay that refinanced mortgage, she said. Judge awards $250,000 to musician who fled Trump-led Kennedy Center gig. The center had sued Chuck Red when he canceled a free concert last year, citing the addition of the Trump name to the venue, but a judge dismissed the case. A judge ordered the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts to pay a musician more than $250,000 in legal fees after dismissing a lawsuit the center had filed against him for backing out of a concert late last year in protest of President Trump's name being added to the institution. The musician, Chuck Red, had canceled a Christmas Eve jazz concert shortly after the president's name was installed on the center's marble facade. Mr. Red, a drummer and a vibraphonist who had hosted the annual holiday concert for nearly 20 years, wrote an email to the center employee saying that he would feel profoundly uncomfortable performing there as long as Mr. Trump's name was on the building. Richard Grenell, the center's president at the time, responded by writing a letter to Mr. Red, threatening to sue him for $1 million for what Mr. Grenell termed a political stunt. The center ultimately sued in D.C. Superior Court for an unspecified amount of damages, accusing Mr. Red of violating his contract. Judge Tanya M. Jones Boisier dismissed the case in June. She found that Mr. Red had not agreed to a contract in the first place and that the Kennedy Center did not appear to have been financially damaged by the cancellation of the concert, which was free. On Monday, the judge awarded Mr. Red more than $252,000 to cover his lawyer's fees and legal costs associated with defending against the lawsuit. The Kennedy Center said in a statement on Tuesday that it planned to appeal the award. Its lawyers argued in court papers ahead of the ruling that the calculation of legal fees by Mr. Red's lawyers, they were seeking more than $258,000, was excessive and astonishing. Mr. Red's lawyers in the case included Lisa Banks and Deborah Katz, high-profile employment lawyers whose clients have included Christine Blasey Ford in her testimony against Justice Brett Kavanaugh during his confirmation process to join the Supreme Court. In a statement on Tuesday, Ms. Banks said that no citizen should have to spend time and money fending off baseless and politically motivated lawsuits filed by the Trump administration. Mr. Trump's takeover of the Kennedy Center in his second term led to boycotts by artists and audience members, particularly after its board voted to add the president's name to the institution. Officials at the center blasted those who pulled out of their commitments and accused them of being politically intolerant. The lawsuit against Mr. Red, though, was the most aggressive action yet taken against an artist who had withdrawn from a planned performance. In May, a federal judge ruled that Mr. Trump's name had been added to the institution unlawfully without the required permission of Congress and ordered that it be removed. The center has appealed the decision, though it removed the added letters from the marble, constructing a towering matrix of scaffolding covered in tarps that obstruct part of the original name. The center is currently in limbo, and it has had a largely bare performance calendar since July as its board considers whether to move forward with the president's plan to close it for 2 years of renovations. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Should letting children play alone outside be a crime? Some parents have been surprised to find themselves in the legal system's crosshairs. Mallory Shirley knew something was wrong the second she saw her then 6-year-old son walk through the front door. It was November 2025, and he had just returned from riding his scooter to a playground about a quarter of a mile from their home in Atlanta, Georgia. Miss Shirley remembers how he looked, shoulders slouched, eyes cast downward. She asked him what had happened. He explained that a woman stopped him on his way home and demanded to know his age, why he was alone, and where he lived. Scared, he ignored the woman and continued on his way. Miss Shirley and her husband, Christopher Pleasance, believed in instilling a sense of independence in their 2 children, and they had recently started to give their son opportunities to do things unaccompanied, like asking him to find items in the grocery store. Typically, after he explained to concerned adults that he had permission from his parents, people felt reassured. But this woman's concern felt more accusatory than empathetic. I think she followed me in her car, Miss Shirley remembers her son telling her. She didn't think much of it until 2 days later when a case manager from the Fulton County Division of Family and Children's Services showed up at her house. Miss Shirley was not home, but Mr. Pleasance was. The case manager explained that a complaint had been filed and that she would need to inspect their home and interview their son at school. The conversation was recorded on the family's Ring camera. When we were growing up, our parents would be like, "Oh, you know, go ahead, it's fine," the case manager said. But now he would have to be like 13. 13, Mr. Pleasance said? Is that the law? I mean, they're going to consider that inadequate supervision for him to go completely by himself, the case manager said, because anything could happen, right? He's extremely vulnerable at that age, the case manager added. In recent years, in places like Baldwin City, Kansas, and Silver Spring, Maryland, parents have been investigated or even arrested for letting their children walk to the store, play in the park, or ride their bicycles unsupervised. Proponents of childhood independence say it's beneficial for kids to have autonomy. Others see this approach as potentially dangerous. And vague child neglect laws force law enforcement to make difficult judgment calls regarding whether a child is in legitimate danger. But as the stories of well-meaning parents have gained attention, the way lawmakers think about child independence is starting to change. All told, 13 states have either created new, less restrictive child neglect laws or amended existing ones. A bipartisan federal bill, the Promoting Childhood Independence as Resilience Act, was introduced in the House of Representatives in May. Despite the shift, some parents are still finding themselves in the government's crosshairs. "I was so naive," Miss Shirley said of the investigation into her family. "I thought that nothing was going to come of this, but I was mistaken." A self-fulfilling prophecy, 2 forces, fear and control, have systematically reduced childhood independence over the past 4 decades, said Sarah Shope Sullivan, a professor of developmental psychology at Ohio State University. First came a newfound worry about child abductions and stranger danger. In 1979, the disappearance of 6-year-old Eaton Potts in New York City drew widespread media attention. Congress passed the Missing Children Act in 1982, and 2 years later, missing children's photos were put on milk cartons nationwide. Inflated statistics on abductions, with estimates sometimes as high as 50,000 minors, annually underpinned the discourse. In reality, authorities estimate that closer to 100 children are kidnapped by strangers each year. These events were contributing factors in cultivating a sense of fear and a need for more protection, said Eliza Pressman, a developmental psychologist and co-founder of the Mount Sinai Parenting Center in New York City. Then in the early 2000s, helicopter parenting started to take hold, particularly in middle-class families. Parents began to control many or even most aspects of their children's lives in order to prepare them for an increasingly competitive society. It was a concern with protection and then a concern with producing successful children. Dr. Shope Sullivan said this leaves children with little time to themselves and often involves things that are scheduled by adults. In a recent Harris poll of children from 8 to 12, 62% said they have never walked or biked somewhere without an adult. We're not allowing children to learn that they're both physically and psychologically tough, said Peter Gray, a research professor of psychology and neuroscience at Boston College and the author of the forthcoming book, Restoring Childhood: How to Set Kids Free in the Age of Anxiety. We assume they're fragile and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, he said. Dr. Gray pointed to more than a dozen studies that draw an association between overprotective parenting and increased rates of anxiety and depression in children, adding that independence increases a child's self-reliance and self-worth. It's not that parents are oblivious to the benefits of giving their kids autonomy. According to a 2023 poll by C.S. Mott Children's Hospital in Ann Arbor, Michigan, 84% of parents from children from 9 to 11 said kids benefit from having free time without adult supervision. But in that same poll, only 50% of parents said that their child would go to find an item in a store when the parent is in a different aisle. There is no way for a child to feel capable and competent without being given space to make survivable mistakes, Dr. Pressman said. You want the child to stretch and bend but not break. That's the premise of healthy child development. Mallory Shirley said that her son was more fulfilled when she let him do things on his own, but with the DFCS investigation looming over their family, Miss Shirley kept her son indoors. We were afraid of being arrested, she said. His mental health really struggled. In late December, the agency notified Miss Shirley and Mr. Pleasance that the complaint against them of child abuse and neglect had been substantiated. The couple hired a lawyer and filed an appeal. They also discovered that the law was on their side. Georgia had recently narrowed the definition of child neglect to give children the right to engage in independent activities, including playing outdoors alone. Ms. Shirley raised this during a recorded phone call with a DFCS supervisor. The supervisor responded, logically speaking, a policy or no policy, let's just talk about being a parent. This baby is 6 years old. How was he able to self-protect at 6 years old? The exchange gave Miss Shirley the impression that the supervisor's personal feelings could be influencing her work on the case. The Georgia Department of Human Services, which oversees Fulton County's DFCS, declined to comment on the investigation into Ms. Shirley and Mr. Pleasance, but in a written statement they said, "We take seriously every report that might be made to the agency and work with law enforcement when appropriate to ensure the safety of Georgia's children." Free-range kids. In 2008, Lenore Skenazy, a mother living in New York City, wrote a column for the New York Sun about why she allowed her 9-year-old son to ride the subway alone. The article went viral, and Ms. Skenazy went on a media blitz explaining why she thought it was detrimental for parents to make judgment calls based on long-shot what-ifs. "I call it worst first thinking," she said in a recent interview. "We've all been trained as parents to go to the worst-case scenario first and proceed as if it's likely to happen." Ms. Skenazy called her belief in reasonable childhood independence the free-range kids movement, as she began to call attention to cases where free-range parenting collided with the law. Eventually, state laws about child neglect began to change. After attending one of Ms. Skenazy's parenting lectures, Connor Boyack, the founder of a libertarian think tank, helped conceptualize the nation's first law on childhood independence, passed in Utah in 2018. It specified that neglect does not include permitting a child whose basic needs are met and who is of sufficient age and maturity to avoid harm or unreasonable risk of harm to engage in independent activities. Georgia revised its bill last year after Brittany Patterson, a mother of 4, was arrested and charged with misdemeanor reckless conduct for allowing her 10-year-old son to walk alone to a nearby dollar store. When deputies from the Fannin County Sheriff's Office came to her house and handcuffed her, "I was livid," she said. She added that her arrest and the subsequent media attention were more traumatizing to her children than anything that had ever happened to them while they were unsupervised. The charges were eventually dropped. This January, Kansas amended its child neglect law after Shaylee Knickerbocker of Baldwin City was twice reported by a neighbor for allowing her preteen children to play outside unsupervised. Both times law enforcement came to Ms. Knickerbocker's house. "I feel a lot of relief to now have a law that protects those decisions," she said. Some experts point out that preventable accidents can occur when a child is given too much independence, and that the new laws could make protecting children more challenging. Last May, a mother and father were charged with involuntary manslaughter after their 7-year-old son was hit by a car and killed while crossing a busy road with his 10-year-old brother in North Carolina. In such cases, adults must be held accountable for their responsibilities to ensure a safe environment for their children, the Gastonian Police Department said in a statement. The couple pleaded guilty and received probation. Karen Ruskin, a family psychotherapist based in Scottsdale, Arizona, said a law of specificity might make law enforcement more hesitant to approach a child to confirm that they're safe. Is a child riding her scooter 1 mile, 2 miles, 4 miles? If a child is home alone, what time will the parents return? Jason Barron, an assistant professor of economics at Duke University who studies child welfare systems, agreed that the concept of child protection is ambiguous and nuanced. You can imagine these types of laws having unintended consequences, just like you could imagine it helping a few families that got tangled up with the system that maybe shouldn't have, he said. The question we have to ask as a society is, do we want to err on the side of caution, or do we want to err on the side of not bothering parents? As for Ms. Shirley, in January, the Georgia Department of Human Services sent a letter stating that they did not agree with Fulton County's finding of neglect and that the allegations would be labeled unsubstantiated. Ms. Shirley and Mr. Pleasance were cleared. Soon after, they allowed their son to once again ride his schooter to the playground alone. He was overjoyed. Ms. Shirley said, "That's all we want as parents, feeling like he is capable of taking care of himself." You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the August 12th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Claudia, and I thank you for listening.